Hi, everyone, and welcome to Smart Buildings, Connecting Components and the Trades, presented by Onsite, HPAC, and Electrical Business Magazines. Thanks for being here. I'm David Kennedy, the editor of Onsite. First off, I want to thank our three panelists for joining us today. 2020 challenged contractors across Canada in a huge number of new ways. It's been an equally busy start to 2021, and we appreciate their taking the time out of their busy schedules to be here with us. I also want to thank Procore, the sponsor of today's panel, for making this discussion possible. Before we get started, just one quick housekeeping item. We've allotted time at the end of the panel for questions. Feel free to ask a question at any time by simply typing it into the question pane on your right. We'll try to get to as many as possible, but we are aiming to keep the discussion to an hour. Now, I want to introduce our panelists. With us today from EllisDon, we have Colin Flock. Colin is Vice President of Operations for the company's Facilities Services Division. He has over 2 decades of experience in operations management, and before joining EllisDon, worked for the University of British Columbia as a leader in the Buildings Operations Group. Among other projects, he recently oversaw the Oakville-Trafalgar Memorial Hospital's transition from the construction to operations phase. Next, we have Erica Brabin, Director of Energy and Sustainability within Black & McDonald's Facilities Services Unit. Erica manages and implements energy and sustainability initiatives at Black & McDonald's nationally and has spent much of her 14-year career managing incentive program projects, conducting energy audits, and facilitating environmental training. Smart cities, energy management, greenhouse gas emissions tracking, and sustainability are just a few of her areas of expertise. Finally, Sam Boyajian, the Vice President of Integrated Building Technology, joins us from Modern Niagara. Sam held a number of positions on both the sales and operations sides at Johnson's Controls, Siemens, and Ameresco before joining Modern Niagara in 2019. He now oversees service areas such as building automation systems and energy management systems for the contractor. So let's get to the reason we're all here today. It's no secret, contractors, engineers, owners, and other industry stakeholders are all seeing smart buildings crop up with more and more frequency across the country. More often than not, major projects worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars have been the ones to go smart first. And as they often have with new ways of building, governments are aiming to lead the way. The growing number of smart hospitals is a good example of this. Before we get too far into the specifics though, Colin, with your experience during both the construction and operations stages, I was hoping you could very quickly take us through what exactly a smart building is.
So I think, thanks, David. So a smart building in its simplest form is a building that connects the various building system information centrally. And that allows that information to be shared across the various building systems. What this does is allow a building operator or an integrator to automate and optimize a building as a system as a whole. So in a conventional building where you're optimizing specifically an air handling unit or a single piece of HVAC equipment, in a smart building you take and optimize the entire building as a system. Probably this. Yeah.
And from contractors' perspective, during construction, what are a couple of the basics that they need to know?
Probably from a contractor perspective is really understanding the technology. So one of the challenges when you're building a smart building is making sure that the information from those systems, different disparate systems, is able to be integrated. So each one can speak to each other. You can bring it into a common form so that information can be shared.
Right, and it sounds like there's probably a lot of opportunities here. I know, Erica, I assume Black & McDonald has been seeing quite a bit of interest in this area, especially as a number, like a longer list of owners get interested. Oh, Erica, your mic's muted.
Absolutely, and I would agree with what Colin just mentioned, the importance of bringing them all together, making sure that they speak to each other. And I think another important thing to keep in mind is understanding what they're going to change about how the building operates. It's nice to have technology, but if it's not going to fundamentally change the way the building operates or drive better outcomes for the facility, then maybe it's not needed. So how do we find the least amount of core technologies that can support the growth in the future? And the integration piece is incredibly important, which we have found on the back end of operations, making sure that they can speak to each other, and then we're actually gleaning information from the data that has been mined from the facility and turning that into actionable information.
Right. And Sam, if you haven't been preempted by any of your colleagues here, is there anything that they've sort of skipped over, big reasons that contractors and subcontractors really should be paying attention to the smart building market?
No, I mean, I think they nailed it. The one piece that we haven't talked about that I think is directly relevant to contractors in the construction world is the fact that it's not just the technology, it's not just the impact it has on the building, it's also the impact that it has on the construction process, in that, some of the quote unquote legacy electrical systems and quote unquote legacy mechanical systems are now bridged together, which, I'm not going to speak for Colin and a general contractor, but I think that complicates life a little bit if you look at it from the way we've always built buildings, right?
All right. And just in terms of general market opportunity, can any of you, estimate sort of what does the market look like today in terms of, who is building these projects?
So I'll take a run at that. I wouldn't be able to guess a dollar amount, David. Like I could make something up, but the reality is a lot of the more forward-looking developers in the commercial space are starting to build this way or try to build this way. And you also referenced the government. I mean, the reality is most of these large P3 healthcare projects have much higher levels of integration in smart buildings than we've historically seen. So I'd say there's a small group of the forward-looking commercial developers, and it's the government leading the way as far as I'm concerned.
I think.
And sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. So I mean, like Erica said about understanding what technology you want to integrate and ensuring you can integrate everything or you can collect all the information, but what are you doing with it? And I think we're finding the same as Sam. We have some very forward-looking clients who want to build a smart building, want to connect everything, but they don't really know why, right? They've heard smart building, I want to connect absolutely everything, and they need somebody to help them with what are you going to do with that information? How are you going to optimize it? And in the government projects, everything gets connected because it's written into an output spec. But on the private sector, they need help on that, on guiding what do you actually want to collect and where your value for money is.
Right. And just looking into the future for this, obviously the market is starting small, like anything. 10 years down the road, is it going to be the situation where most building projects are now smart, or is it going to take a little longer than that to sort of fully get into the market? Little uncertainty, I guess.
I think we're all just being polite. I mean, I think, first of all, smart in my mind is not a binary term, right? So I don't know that we'll be able to say that all buildings will be smart, but I think 10 years from now, I think even sooner than that, you're going to see the sort of the table stakes as far as integration and as far as the way we build will be different than they are today. So I think that's going to be the rule, not the exception, that customers are looking for a more technologically advanced, smart, integrated building.
Especially as we see some of that optimization, we see the effects on energy. I mean, energy obviously is a huge deal for every building owner. And so once we start seeing these early adopters, and the effects it's having on their energy use on the building, I think Sam's right. Like in the next 10 years, it'll be a different landscape.
I think we're at a bit of an inflection point, right? Like we've been talking about this as an industry for probably 20 years. And if you went to an owner 20 years ago and talked about this, they're like, yeah, that's great, but, and then nothing happened for 15 of those 20 years. And all of a sudden it just became the thing. And now I would argue that the owners and the developers have sort of leapfrogged the engineering community, and now they're starting to pull the rest of us along because now they're demanding it, as opposed to a bunch of techie people or a bunch of engineering folks saying, hey, this is cool, you should look at it. It's actually the other way around now.
Right. And obviously, sort of as if we have hit an inflection point with this, it's something contractors and subcontractors are going to have to be paying more attention to. And, with a name like Smart Buildings, it kind of can be a bit intimidating for some contractors, especially those who, tends to be a little bit behind the curve in terms of technology. A lot of the time, industry gets a lot of criticism for that. So maybe we touch on a little bit a few of the barriers to entry. You know, Erica, maybe from your perspective, what are you seeing? You know, does the subcontractor need to be hooked into the cloud already? Do they need to be using construction management software in order to tackle some of these problems, or is that even more advanced than some of the smart buildings?
No, I mean, I would feel like that is expectation at this point on some of the projects. You guys mentioned healthcare. That's a lot of the projects that we're exposed to because the energy requirements are so high. So that, you know, brings my team in a lot. So I think the expectation is already there that you're using that. And it's driven a lot from people's own personal use of technology. That's grown so much that if I can do this with my phone, why can't I do this in my facility? So the tools are there if you're not using them already. I would say that could create a lag in the types of projects that you're working on. But it's a huge benefit to us playing both of those roles, being maybe an M&E contractor, but then also doing operations on the other side, to be able to take advantage of some of the technologies or cloud-based tools that are used during construction to make for a very easy handoff into operations, to better understand what the facility use requirements are, how we can change that and update that over time.
Right. And maybe can you give us a couple examples of the tools that you're actually using on site during the construction phase that are really helping you once you get to operations?
Sure. Probably won't name specific softwares, but tools would be things like photo tagging. So to be able to update progress along the way using photos that then can be analyzed and used in reporting. So taking a lot of the manual work out of the constant progress updates so that people can understand when materials are on site, what's been installed. And then I would say the final integration piece is incredibly important. And I'm sure, Sam, you have a lot to add to that as well. But when we get to that final stage of bringing all those pieces of information together and then handing it over to the operations team, making sure that is fluid.
Right. And Sam, it sounds like, or Eric is anticipating anyway, that you're probably in a similar situation where, you know, a lot of the software requirements are going to be, you know, not necessarily steep, but for those not, you know, fairly advanced already in their adoption of some of this stuff, may be in trouble when it comes to smart building.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's steep. I think honestly, the software is out there and the partnerships are out there and the folks that do this for a living are out there. I think it's more of a cultural thing in the contracting community that, you know, my only piece of advice is don't double down on the status quo. Like, this is happening and that's just the way it's going to be. And, you know, construction is partnerships. That's none of us on this call do everything in building a building. So it really is about finding the right teams and the right people to work with to get this done. I don't think it's an intimidating thing as long as you're accepting of the fact that it's change and change is happening, right? And just to touch on one point that Erica made there about the integration at the end before handing over to operations, I think that's where a lot of the times where a smart building ends up disappointing the people that are moving into it. It's not because the technology can't do it. It's not because it wasn't designed properly. It's because there's that extra step that never existed before, where now we need to actually sit down and say, when this happens in this system, that happens in that system. And that last step of integration, if you skip that, basically what you have is a really fancy building that does nothing any different than it would have if you built it the other way, right? So that integration piece is critical. And you know, the more the industry understands that, the better things get for the building owner, right?
Right. And from your, sorry, go ahead, Colin.
Well, I was going to say, and I think that you know, Sam said right, the integration at the end is critical, and I think the GCs and the trades that understand how important the integration is and sees the value in that integration and doesn't treat it as okay, so now we're done the building, now I'm going to integrate and then I hand the building over. You know, there's a lot of advantages to the constructor on collecting information that's all collected in a central location to then help the hand over to the owner so that they don't call you back when the building's not working because you provided them all the information in a good format that they can use.
And at the early stages of this, you know, Colin, seeing how you're just speaking, from a general contractor's perspective, who may not have, you know, taken on a smart building before, are there any, you know, is there a couple, you know, key takeaways that you could share that, you know, steps that they would need to take to be ready for this?
Yeah, I think I think Sam said it. I mean, it's an open mind, right? I think if you go in understanding that this is coming and it's the way things are going to change, you go in with an open mind, understanding what it can do for you. So a lot of, if I think to the Oakville Hospital, that was a fairly early smart hospital that was integrated, and it was really treated as the final step was the integration. The final step was collecting that information. And what we've realized through running it is that there's a whole bunch of things that are this great information that had we understood that during the construction phase, especially during commissioning, it would have been very advantageous to us. So I think you go in with an open mind, and like Sam said, you grab the partners that understand the technology, understand what you're doing, and then from a GC perspective, getting all of your various trade groups to speak to each other, because you're no longer mechanical and electrical. You're like one team building a system. So it's a lot, but there's tons of advantages especially on the commissioning side.
And Erica or Sam, anything to add on what maybe a subcontractor would need to do to get ready?
I think a subcontractor needs to get comfortable doing things that, or preparing themselves to maybe either, perform a scope of work that they haven't in the past, or work with, call it peer contractors that they haven't in the past, right? I think that's from a sub perspective, that's the biggest part of it, where, like all of a sudden you're dealing with software companies, you're dealing with networking companies, you're dealing with product vendors. It's not sort of the same team where you just copy and paste from project to project. There's a fluidity to it that maybe didn't exist before.
Yeah, I would agree, and I'm also seeing a real need for training, especially on the trades that it's almost as if roles are shifting, or the definition of what a facility manager is and what a facility manager does every day has changed a lot. Even from when I started at Black & Mac until now, they almost need to have some sort of IT background or begin to understand that while they're in that facility. So how do we make sure that we're providing everybody the right kind of training? Is that through the union hall itself, making sure that a controls contractor can easily communicate with the electrician that's there to support that job, or else there's so many ways for communication to break down, and as you said, Colin, we can end up with a really fancy building that is not really delivering on what we promised. I mean, we've seen meters that they're internet enabled, but they were never actually tapped back to the BAS. So they're there because they met a requirement in the spec, but they're not actually being utilized. So how do we avoid problems like that in the future?
And on the opposite end of it, as opposed to being ready for this, have any of you ever encountered a contractor or sub that has kind of come onto one of these projects and taken a major misstep? Is there anything, things to avoid?
Sure, without naming names. Yes, I think, and maybe I'm going to sound like a broken record, right? But I think the thing to avoid, and where it starts to really hit, is in the procurement phase. Is often, the way that go get 3 prices for something and go with the low bid and sort of build the building that way. I think doing that as the automatic reflex, I think, is where things start to fall flat. Because if you think about the need to align trades and the need for the electrical contractor to be providing something that the technology contractor can integrate to, that can then go to the mechanical contractor and connect to the building automation system, and all of that becomes, and it may not be specified that way, right? Because specs are built in silos as well. But oftentimes, I think that's where the missteps happen. That's where the disappointment happens. That's where the owner ends up moving into a building and saying that this thing doesn't do what I thought it was going to do. And that's something that's completely avoidable, in my opinion.
I would agree with the procurement practices and encourage people to take a more innovative or outcome-based approach to procurement, to define what it is you hope to achieve with the facility, and then let the market tell you what creative ways are to achieve that versus just the 3 quotes. We just want a BIS that does this. There might be really exciting ways to achieve that you haven't heard about yet. So if you can encourage the market to tell you that, you can end up achieving those outcomes in a cost-effective way and have a more creative system.
Right, and we actually had a question that came in that's quite similar to this, and it's just wondering about, where may a developer or owner, turn for some of this information? Someone who may not know this sort of stuff, how do they go to market and get some of the information they need?
I can add that we've actually just used some of the standards that are out there for innovative procurement practices, which is starting by defining what all of your outcomes are, ensuring that you have the data to back up what those outcomes will be and that they can be measured and verified on the back end. And then inviting people to look at the facility, look at the project, hold a number of creative discussion or competitive discussion sessions with the people that provide you with the ideas. And we've been successful doing that.
Right. Perfect. Well, maybe move to the next topic here. And this one is, we've touched on a little bit about this already, and I think most people already know the answer to this one. But, when it comes to building systems within these smart buildings, is there any one, electrical, mechanical, that's sort of the linchpin of it all? Or is it, does it all need to come together to work perfectly?
I think linchpin might be the wrong word, but I think all roads lead to your network, right? Like the reality is your IT or OT or both, or however it's being designed, those networks are the critical component, and the networking strategy and the understanding of the networking strategy amongst all of the players. To me, that's the piece that touches everything. I mean, you can draw a scope matrix and connect systems to other systems, and they're all important, but the one constant through them all in my mind is the network.
Right.
Yeah, and it's that, and ensuring that communication protocol on that network, that everybody speaking the same language, because you get into a point where, even back to the procurement, where you're procuring something and you get this one piece of kit that just won't talk to anybody else, and now you're into an integration workaround, which is challenging. So yeah, your network and integration path is the key.
Right.
I agree.
Perfect. And in terms of construction itself, obviously one of the big things that we talk about with smart buildings and that we've mentioned a couple times already is owners see potential cost savings when it comes to the operations phase for GCs or subs. Within construction itself, are there any areas to take advantage of during the construction phase that I guess wouldn't be available in a conventional build?
So I can probably take a crack. I mentioned commissioning I think we're seeing the big savings or efficiencies in commissioning, and although the commissioning is slightly more complicated with a smart building, because you do have that integration piece and you're treating the building as a system, you do have a lot more data. So from a GC perspective, or if you're managing a sub, you don't just rely on these tick box exercises of, yes, the system works. You actually have proof and you have data, and you can collect that data over a longer period of time and the effects on other systems. So we're seeing some efficiencies on our commissioning side. For sure, the sweating that we would have sometimes close to as we're finishing up commissioning disappears, because more people can look at it in a smart building.
Right.
Say there's also, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
No, go ahead, Arka, please.
I was just going to add that there's some advantages to the predictability side of a project as well. Can you look at certain indicators along the way to predict even things like project schedule, project budget, that normally would be maybe guesswork in the past. So now you can look at updated progress reports that are happening in real time versus material insight versus progress made to date to predict how the project will progress along the way.
Yeah, I think those are both excellent points, and I think the last one from a cost savings perspective for a contractor is ultimately embracing this. When your customer wants it, just means you have to go back fewer times afterwards, right? Like the reality is, we could build a smart building and and do it the hard way. And even if the cost doesn't show up in the actual construction, at the end of the day, when that thing doesn't do what it was supposed to do, that's still all of our problems, right? So there's a cost avoidance component to it too.
Right, just making sure clear expectations sort of once you get to the end, I guess.
Well, like a fundamental understanding of what it is you're trying to do and why it's different, and entering it that way as opposed to using the muscle memory and thinking that that's going to get you through, right?
Right. And in terms of maintenance, obviously, is another major area here. What are a few of the ways that smart buildings alter the maintenance process, whether it's sensors, predictive maintenance, and other aspects like that?
I think predictive maintenance is huge. I think it is a fundamental change in the way that contractors like Modern Ag or like Black & Mac are going to be, providing maintenance to our customers moving forward. Like my team's sick of me saying this, but as a techno geek, it's almost offensive to me that in the year 2021, customers have to pick up a phone and call us when something's wrong. Like there's almost no other place in your life where that's still the case, right? You can order a pizza and you know exactly where the guy is on your street before he gets there, and yet you call your HVAC contractor and they probably will show up and you have no idea who's coming or when they're coming or what. They don't know what they're coming to do. They're just coming based on your phone. Like all of that is unnecessary, with the state of technology today. So we're going to see a hard push towards predictive maintenance, towards fault detection, diagnostics, and analytics platforms, and the ability for the systems to remotely, maybe not diagnose, but certainly assess issues, predict upcoming issues based on past performance. All of that is coming, and all of that is enabled by the smart building.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sam, 100%. That is where it's going, and in some cases already is, depending on what kind of equipment we're talking about. But the need is there, and it is crazy to me sometimes that we still have to follow some of the old processes for things like that when the technology is there, for sure. I think another thing that it's changing for our own technicians is empowering them, not just with information about what that potential diagnosis is. If they're leading with performance indicators of the facility as well, it can empower them to share their own ideas back to us about the life cycle of that asset. Maybe we can extend it, or maybe there's an efficiency opportunity versus just fix it, get out, let's close out the work order and move on. We can provide them with more information going in.
And Colin, from your perspective, obviously, sometimes in the past, obviously you're building the asset originally, and in the past it's often been, you hand off the keys and you're kind of done with it. Are you seeing that evolve a little bit as these smart buildings come online?
Yeah, I think, well, we operate the buildings as well. So the handoff, I guess, is a little smoother in a smart building for us because we don't, I think, so Sam and Erica talked about, the building and predictive maintenance and those pieces, but we also see, we can centralize technical resources. So, and we operate a number of buildings now, so we can centralize, the fault detection and diagnostics and some of the machine learning across building systems, across multiple buildings. So event happens in one building, and we're able to use that information to affect the decisions made on another building. So from the construction aspect, I think everybody gets a little more comfortable because we know the buildings are going to be running more smoothly, and we have a little more oversight on how the buildings are running, and it makes the handover a lot easier for us.
Right. A lot of data to handle, I guess, there.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable amount of data. So, and I think Erica touched on the beginning, people trying to figure out what data they actually need to keep and what they want to do with it. And we're fortunate to work in the P3 world where that's dictated to us. And so we collect all the data. So we can kind of filter through it and figure out what works and not. And, in the case of the Oakville Hospital, that building's coming on 6 years since substantial completion. And we're still finding information that we're collecting that we can use for something else for future use. So yeah, it's a lot of data. A lot of data traffic, I guess, is the better way to put it. Yeah.
Sam or Erica, anything to add in terms of some of the data that you're using or finding new ways to use it?
Sure. Go ahead, Sam.
You go.
Let Sam go this time.
No, you go ahead. I'll go.
I agree with you, Colin. It's a lot of data traffic and a lot of figuring out, first of all, what it is, what we're going to use it for, how are we going to store it, how often do we need it? Some people get really excited about interval data. We're going to get it every 15 seconds. Well, a system doesn't change that much in 15 seconds. Do we really need that? And then again, what are we going to do with it? So their excitement about data is there, but I think that we have to decide now what we're going to do with it and make sure that we're getting the value out of it and not just heaping and storing it, especially for P3s over a 30-year period. What do we do with it at the end? Did we actually get value out of it? So let's decide what we're going to do with it before we collect mountains of it.
Yeah, I mean, that was basically my message. Like we as an industry right now, we're the kid with the cell phone that takes 700 pictures and doesn't delete any of them, right? And you only really needed one of those pictures. So I think we need to figure out, having the mountains of data is great. You got to do something with it. You got to figure out what's useful. And sometimes sifting through the mountain of data is harder than sifting through 10 data points, right? So, you know, I'm confident that we as an industry are going to figure this out, but we're at that early stage of, you know, like Colin mentioned, machine learning. I mean, that's where this needs to go, right?
Right. Take some of that those points, data points off your plate, I guess. Sorry, Colin, go ahead.
You picture the old days of it's not actually that long ago, but like, you know, BAS, and I've got a trend with like 5 lines on it, and I can figure out what's gone wrong. And those 5 lines are now like 30 that are talking about the same system. And so how do you filter through that to get yourself a pattern and whatever? And I think, you know, like Sam said, machine learning is really the only way you can filter through that. Otherwise, you end up with building operators or technicians that are just overwhelmed with the amount of information they have.
And just jumping to sort of looking ahead to the future again, obviously there's a lot of evolution going on here. And I imagine, Colin, you alluded to it a moment ago, you know, a smart building 10 years ago probably doesn't look the same as a smart building does today. Erica, maybe do you want to touch a little bit on, you know, how smart has evolved over the last few years?
Yeah, when I looked at this question initially, it made me laugh to think, because I've had many conversations with colleagues about, well, what does smart mean? And when is your building actually smart? When can you hang a tag on it and say it's officially smart, we're done, it's smart enough? And I don't think it'll ever be done or ever mean the same thing, even year to year. And with the past year, what we've just experienced, I think smart building initially was the connectivity, the energy efficiency, and being able to trend and capture all this data. But now, over the past year, expectations have changed. We might want to track occupancy patterns. We might want to track indoor air quality. People might want assurances that the air changes per hour in their space have been achieved. And how do we make sure that we provide that in defendable and report it in a way that's easier for people to digest, so people want to feel safe and healthy in an efficient space? So I think it's changed a lot, and I think it's exciting to think that it will continue to change, and that we'll have to find a balance of what all these technologies can do with each other. How do we balance energy efficiency with some of the wellness trends of increased airflow through facility or changes in occupancy patterns? And we saw that when some buildings shut down, some buildings didn't, and people expected to save because no one was there, without realizing that there was still the same energy usage because nobody had optimized the system to actually turn down and turn off based on who was in there and who wasn't in there. So I think I mentioned it earlier, people's expectations, or the technology that we use, we assume our building can do the same thing, that they assume that no one was there, so it must have turned off. So that has just heightened within the past year, and I think it will always continue to change, which, I mean, I think is good for everybody hearing the conversation.
Colin and Sam, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I see 2 vectors of change, if you think about it. And again, we started this with a definition of smart buildings, which is funny because I don't think there was a definition of smart buildings, or I don't think there's a static definition of smart buildings. But the 2 biggest vectors that I see this changing along are, you know, one, from a building operator perspective, I think it will continue to change and drive towards almost autonomy, right? Like we have call it a peer company in the States, and you know, I heard this term from them first, where you know, somebody said, we know what an autonomous vehicle is, but what's an autonomous building? And I would argue that we as an industry don't know what an autonomous building is, because they're still very touch heavy, they're very human heavy, right? I'm not saying they'll ever be completely autonomous, but you know, there's that vector. And the second change is, you know, we've spent a lot of time as an industry integrating building systems, you know, controls and security and lighting and blinds and, you know, whatever else. At some point, that leap happens between the systems that run the building and the actual systems that run the businesses that are in the building. You know, you're integrating to healthcare systems, you're integrating to VoIP systems in commercial spaces, you're integrating to tenant, you know, apps and wayfinding and room booking and all these other systems that are, you know, same kinds of technology, just being used for different purposes, as opposed to the actual operation of the building. So I see that getting a lot closer as well.
And we talked a little bit earlier, or Colin, you mentioned it, you know, how Elliston is no longer just building the buildings. You know, you're also moving into operations and sort of seeing things through over a 30-year term or whatever the P3 contract might dictate. Obviously, this is indicative of, you know, owners taking a bit more of a life cycle approach to some of these assets. Are you expecting to see more and more owners or developers taking that route?
Yeah, I think the bigger ones will. I think, you know, the facility management world has changed significantly over the last, call it 10 years, and people are paying attention to building maintenance a little more. And I think part of that is just buildings are aging, and now we're getting into life cycle, and so people are asking why there's a capital replacement and how do we extend that life. So we're seeing more of our clients looking for that whole life approach and give us a model on what the building looks like. And if we spend a little more, do something a little bit different up front, what does that look like 30 years from now? So, I mean, we obviously have to look at that for P3 reasons, but more and more of the private clients are looking at that for sure.
Right. And I might just jump to questions at this point, simply because we have a whole lot of them. So may as well take a whack at as many of them as we can. The first one's actually for Colin. It says, Colin mentioned that developers may need help understanding what exactly a smart building technology entails. What can they do to look for guidance?
Yeah, I think actually Sam alluded to it. I mean, you probably want to find a partner. You want to know somebody who understands the industry or understands the concept, even if it's not your trade partner, but just somebody who can help guide you, because there's no one way of doing a smart building. You need somebody who can take your thoughts and ideas and put them to paper so you have a good scope, and also somebody who can show you the art of the possible, right? So the what else can you do? I mean, I think, you know, we're to a point where, you know, an owner can, or a developer can think of anything and you can make it happen with technology. Some obviously a lot of cost, but you know, I think there's a lot of groups out there, Elliston included, who will sit with people and help guide you down that path of like, what else can you do? You know, and some developers are looking at on the residential side, they're looking to their clients. I mean, we talked about where's a smart building going, and we're seeing like on the residential side that there's a push to, you know, give the data about the building to the tenant, you know, and it's not necessarily they're going to do anything with it, but they want to know. Their phone tells them how many steps a day they take. They want to know how much electricity they're using. They want to know when their heat was on and off, and they're not going to do anything with it, but they just want it, right? And so how do you connect that data, and it becomes a selling point?
All right. And another one here is, how close is the conversation between smart buildings and net zero energy beyond the human-centric application of the technology?
So I can probably take a stab at that. I mean, I don't think you'd be really challenged to get to net zero, I think, without a smart building. I mean, I don't know how you do it. We've done some work with a few facilities. We have a net zero facility that we're doing research on. So Mohawk College put it up, and that's one where there's just so much data there, and so they reach net zero. But then they're looking at, you know, what are the specific systems and how are they running per the original design. So are we actually seeing, we got to net zero, but are we seeing the original design drive us to net zero, or other things happening? So you need it in a net zero building, I guess is the short of it.
Yeah, I think if you're not measuring it, you can't improve it either, right? Like the reality is net zero is all well and good and zero carbon and all that, but that's day one. And at the end of year 1 and year 5 and year 10, things change, right? And a smart building allows you to stay on top of that.
And you're not like in a net zero building, it's not this one system that needs to get to zero. It's this system makes a change, which means this other system needs to do something different to keep you all balanced. So yeah, it's very connected.
Right. I have another one here talking, so it's from a mechanical contractor. He says, I'm contemplating investing in a software package to improve my cloud abilities. How will I know if the other sub or GC is using compatible software?
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good question. And you know, like the sponsor David referenced earlier in Procore is a great example where there are now, they're not industry standards, but we're trending towards industry standard software packages that more and more contractors are using. And like, not to advertise for anybody, but the reality is I also think the GCs are driving this pretty heavily where, you know, if Ellis Don decides here's what we're using, then guess what? That's what half the industry is using, right? So, you know, I think a little bit of research as to what some of the big guys are doing probably would benefit there.
Yeah, and just making sure that your technology partner, as you guys mentioned, partnerships are very important. That they understand what your requirements are. So if you're on the smaller side and you're trying to interact with some of these bigger companies, that your platform is open enough, and make sure that we understand what open protocol means. Open protocol does not equal easy integration. BACnet compatible does not equal easy integration. So how do we make sure that the partner has created that open platform for you to be able to speak to whatever tools are out there? So I think it's really lean on the resources that are there for you.
Right. And have another one here talking about modular construction. It's a pretty simple one. Can a modular building be smart?
I think the answer to that is absolutely. In fact, there may be scenarios where it's easier.
Yeah.
Because you're in a much more controlled environment when you're doing the build, and you're prefabricating and you're, you know, making connections not in the field. And so, yeah, to me, that's a for sure yes.
Sure. And another one here is, what do you believe are the low-hanging fruit for sensor data to be tracked?
Sensors to go back and add to an existing facility. It's anything that's not disrupting a space that's normally occupied is usually easier for us to be able to go in. So base building systems are easy for us to add sensors to because they're not going to impact occupancy. So it's not necessarily system driven for us all the time. It can be, how are we going to disrupt the normal activities of the facility to go in and add stuff? So it's easier to do it in the beginning, but anything that we can do without disrupting is usually easier for us to do.
I think the lowest hanging fruit for the sensor data, honestly, is probably the sensors that are already there, just you actually using the data for something other than, you know, what it says on the drawing. You know, if you think about a building automation system, you know, like there's sensors everywhere doing everything, but that data maybe can be used in a different way. You know, one of the examples that we've been talking about a lot internally is, you know, historically, customer calls, says I'm cold, you check the set point, you check the space temperature, and you say, well, put on a sweater, like it's doing what it's supposed to do. But is anybody looking at the air coming out of the diffuser and the velocity there? Is anybody looking at, you know, like how much air do I need to serve to that space in order to maintain that temperature? These are all variables that we have access to. And a really good building operator would be able to pick up on that. You know, we're using the tools or the technology as a force multiplier, so that maybe you don't need your rockstar building operator. Maybe anybody looking at this, like a layman like me, could walk up to it and say, yeah, that's what's going on, right? So I think the low-hanging fruit has nothing to do with the physical installation of new sensors. It's just, what are you going to do with it?
Sure. And next one's for Colin. Can you expand on what you said about the Oakville Hospital experience? Can you give an example of lessons you learned that you would want to either do differently or implement elsewhere?
We only have 15 minutes. So.
Try not to take the whole time.
Yeah. I think probably the biggest lessons, and we touched on it at the beginning, is just, you know, the integration and appreciating that the integration is not an end thing that you do at the end and just kind of, you know, finish because you got to hit substantial. I think it's appreciating that the integration is part of the building as a whole and is an important part. And so, you know, a lot of upfront work on that piece. Our approach to buildings going forward, again, I keep saying commissioning, but like the commissioning approach is very different. Just, you know, what the design intent of the building is, focusing on that design intent. How are the various systems interacting with each other? You know, is there any conflict with you know, the original intent or design intent? And getting early so that it's early running and early understanding that those integrations are working properly. So we see those in the buildings going forward. Like all the new buildings are like that. There's a huge focus on that integration piece and the connectivity to it. That's probably the biggest lesson. Yeah.
Great. And we've touched a little bit on this one, but what steps has the smart building industry taken to establish national standards and practices, if any?
I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's a bit of a idealistic question because that would be nice. I think there are de facto standards that have happened. I don't know that the space has been well defined enough, or the industry has sort of gotten together enough to actually talk about here's what we're going to do nationally from a standards perspective. I think it's really what has been done in the past sort of gaining momentum. You know, I mean, you know, Erica mentioned BACnet earlier. Like, you know, for those of us that have been around a long time, you know, it was a lot of work to get BACnet to where it is today as a standard, right? And even then, it doesn't make it easy. So I don't. If there are standards out there, that's kind of news to me at this point.
Yeah.
Sure. And the next one here, person would be interested in the evolution of master technology integrator in the last few years, where that is headed. That one goes over my head, but maybe you guys have an answer for that.
Was that a question? I mean, there's. So here's the thing, and I think that's actually it's a really insightful point. The concept of a master systems integrator is something that we're all going to have to get pretty familiar with, I think. You know, I've used this example in the past at an AHR show a couple of years ago. There was actually a seminar put on called The Extinction of the Controls Contractor and the Evolution of the Master Systems Integrator, right? So I think that's going to become the low voltage integration person on all construction. Like that the bridge that I referenced earlier between the mechanical and the electrical, you know, it's going to suck up the building automation system from one side and a whole bunch of low voltage stuff from the other side and provide you that single point of contact for that integration. And I think that's the best way to go forward, as opposed to trying to coordinate, you know, 22 subcontractors. So, I mean, it's a great concept. I'm not sure if I answered anything, but.
Yeah.
Another one here is how does the smart building platform can help with dispositions? For example, the need to replace some critical equipment so that risk can be minimized to make a data-driven decision.
So Colin, you kind of touched on lifecycle before, and that's a huge piece of, you know, managing on the P3 side. And it's very important for us to have that data to actually make a case for changes of equipment on that facility. And that's where efficiency comes into play a lot as well, to show that you've been running it to spec as efficiently as possible. What has been outlined in terms of when it turns on, when it turns off, what those set points are, to really build a case on when you should replace it, because people on the other side have become more savvy to actually extending the life cycle on it. So if we've been running it efficiently and we've got these smart building technologies that are out there to make the building run better over time, then why do we need to replace it when the manufacturer says, how do we continue to keep it on the shelf to get the maximum value without running to fail, because there are, you know, as you guys know, for some assets, they reach a point where then keeping them on will just continue to drive up energy costs over time. So it is important to have these technologies there to help build the case around when it is changed, why it's changed, what the most efficient piece of equipment is going to be, and then the back end M&P plan on that as well.
And I think that's right. And then you know, a lot of times manufacturers are talking about, you know, just basic run hours or whatever on a system. If you're not tracking those hours, that becomes complicated. So then you're turning that into how many years is the piece of equipment. Even if you're tracking the hours, you're not tracking how hard is that piece of equipment running. So all this additional data then tells you how hard have I run the equipment, or what's its performance. You know, Erica talked about the energy side. So am I seeing energy efficiencies drop? And it allows you to, one, replace a piece of equipment before it becomes too energy inefficient and it's costing you a fortune, or also to run it, bleed it a little bit longer so that you're not replacing an early piece of equipment. So you're a lot further ahead. And then because you have all that data, you can mitigate the risk of catastrophic failure, unknown catastrophic failure, because there are points that you can watch to make sure that the piece of equipment's not going to fail.
Yeah, that last piece is really exciting. Like, you know, you could paint a picture of the future where, and I'm going to go back to machine learning and sucking up data. You know, those pieces of equipment are probably not all that unique. I mean, they're unique circumstances and unique installations, but generally, just, I mean, if it's on a roof over here, it's probably on a roof across the street or across the city. And if you have an analytics platform that is smart enough, that has enough access to data, you know, theoretically, you could be in a situation where your analytics can pop up and say, hey, based on what we're seeing and based on what we've seen elsewhere over the last months and years, when this, and this happened, which just happened to you, that piece of equipment is going to go in 6 months, right? Yep. Or it's going to, you know, you've got a year, you've got 2 years left, and it allows you to roll that into capital planning. It allows you to really manage budgets more effectively, manage energy spend more effectively. It's, you know, it's a really exciting vision. And, you know, again, technologically, we're there. The technology exists today.
Another one here is the panel seeing a need for smart building technology to have APIs to connect to other software solutions? EV chargers is the example they're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we've got to be open to that connectivity, and you've got to allow others, or you've got to be able to write those connections to each other's software packages. So I think a concept like APIs is critical. You know, otherwise it just becomes a series of walled gardens, and that doesn't benefit anybody.
Yeah, and I think, Sam, you alluded to the networks earlier. We've got to make sure that we're leaving space on those networks as well as we start to add more things in the future. We've had facilities have to, you know, split networks just to handle some of the influx of technologies that's come into the building. So that planning side of it's very important.
And furthermore, we're going to go outside of the building, right? Like at some point, it's going to be the business systems that the business is using, and you've got to be able to integrate to, you know,
yeah,
their email, their room booking, their, you know, Microsoft and Google and whatever else.
And the cost of integrations are coming down, and people don't have the patience to pay the exorbitant cost to integrate the way we used to. So, you know, building owners or frankly us, we don't accept things that are costly to integrate because there's no need anymore.
Yeah, and not only that, our standards for integration have gone up, right? We used to be able to get away with calling a couple of wires coming out of a relay integration, and that just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
Right, and I imagine this one could be a conversation unto itself, but are there any legal implications associated with smart building systems?
Yes. The first thing that came to mind was privacy. You know, we all saw the Google Sidewalk Labs City of Toronto, you know, problems column, and a lot of it comes down to, you know, you're collecting data and you're harvesting data. You can use that data to infer usage patterns and where I was and how many times this person went to the bathroom, and, you know, like those are important points. You can't ignore the human factors here.
Yeah, I mean, people counters on residential buildings are huge. Trying to track usage of a centralized space is people counters, and that's privacy of data. Nobody, you don't want to be known that you went into whatever the workout room however many times, and so they collect that information. And then back to the networks too. So what other traffic is going? So when you're building a facility, keeping the private data separate on a separate network so that it isn't with your building systems, because you have security issues, right? As your building gets smarter, it also becomes a little bit more open and open to security challenges.
I think another thing to think about is the liability of information as well. So when you think about a fault detection alert, who decides when they respond to that fault? What takes priority over other faults, and what is your liability in knowing that information versus response times? And I'm sure everybody in the discussion right now knows what it's like to not respond in the correct response time and incur penalties for such things. So how do you plan ahead for that and get buy-in from everybody so that everybody's on board with what those response times are, what getting information means, and who's responsible for acting on it?
Yep, sure. And jumping in a different direction here, another question. I'm a BAS contractor. In our industry, it is always a fight with some engineering firms to get on board with change. How can we get everyone on board with making some of these changes to go more into the smart building realm?
So I'll speak to that briefly. Absolutely true. I think, especially in the engineering community, there's been a lot of reluctance because ultimately they're writing a piece of paper that they have to live with, and if they spec out this beautiful smart building and the industry can't deliver, they're left holding that bag. So I've actually had this discussion with some engineering firms in Toronto, and the feedback I got across the board from executives in those companies was, we've been waiting for the industry to get there. Like, nothing would make us happier than to write all of our specs this way, than to bring master systems integrators in, and to pull these pieces out of the traditional specs, and or to design integrations. But the fear was, if we do that, there's nobody on the other end who can deliver, and it's just going to introduce confusion into the construction process. So, almost a better safe than sorry approach. And it wasn't because of the philosophy or because they didn't believe in it. It's because of the practicalities of how do you deliver on it, or, in the past, maybe haven't gotten burned on how to deliver on it. So I think we as an industry have a responsibility to, maybe it's not quite chicken and the egg, but we kind of have to go baby steps together to get there with the engineering community. At least that's my opinion.
Perfect. And let's see here. Is there any data collected within the building shared with other disciplines besides the building operator? This kind of probably harkens back to the privacy issue. For example, in a hospital, water use with infection protection and control.
Yeah, so so I'll go back to Oakville. So Oakville is well integrated. There are two separate networks. There's a hospital network and then the building systems network. And so we share information across those two networks so that the end users have visibility to everything they want to have visibility to, and it gets parsed in a way that, or presented in a way that they can absorb the data, or at least understand the information that they're looking for. So we see that a lot on, obviously, fire alarm systems, and HVAC in a hospital is very important, so that information goes across the network. And then from a public standpoint, people like to display how is the building doing, how much water is it using, how much energy, and so that becomes a public display.
And this one, again, it's one of those that I probably know the answer to, but considering how quickly smart technologies are evolving, is it challenging for it is challenging for buildings and developers to keep up? How do you future-proof a building to accommodate emerging trends? Or is there a way?
Yeah, that's a tough word, right? I'm not sure that future-proof is feasible. That said, I think there are decisions that we can make that help, and I think the biggest one there is not going too deep into proprietary technologies that require proprietary installations with proprietary connections, because that's the sort of stuff that gets you into trouble down the road. But future proofing is, if we had that answer, we wouldn't be here, right?
Sure.
I don't know.
Anything to add, Colin or Erica? Maybe not. I'm sorry, Sam.
No, I was going to say the example I can think of, sort of in the personal sense, is, I know somebody who built a smart home, and in every room they put an iPod dock, like with that old Apple, the wide connector, like 5 iPhone generations ago. And so now that's on your wall forever, right? Like, maybe you couldn't future-proof that connection, so maybe future-proof meant just don't put the thing in, right?
Yeah, I think Sam said it earlier, like that network backbone, like the network infrastructure, that's probably your key. Non-proprietary, absolutely. Like but the iPhone connector is a great example, but you get, building systems that are proprietary and you can't connect to them. And so even if the information is there on that system, there's no way of getting access to it, even if you wanted to at a future state, that becomes a problem.
Right. And Erica, any final words? We're just at 2 o'clock now, so I want to wrap up. Do you have anything to add on that point?
I agree with you guys. The non-proprietary is a big one for us, and open API is available to integrate for future, and the network piece is important as well. So that's it.
Great. Well, everyone, appreciate your time. And once again, I want to thank our sponsor, Procore, for making the discussion possible. And of course, the 3 of you for also making it possible and taking the time out of your schedules. I know things are busy, so I'm sure we and everybody listening in appreciates it. For everyone listening in, if you missed any part of the discussion, the webinar will be available on demand shortly, so just check back on our website and we'll have it up before long. Otherwise, thanks again, Colin, Sam, Erica, and everyone for listening in. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks,
everyone.